Hi everybody, we're on lesson 6 and we're moving on to stage 3 and the presentation of the Ghost of Christmas Present. So just to catch you up, at this point of the novella, Scrooge has seen all the people from his past and has now moved on to meeting the second ghost, the Ghost of Christmas Present. And this ghost is different from the Christmas past because of the fact that the way in which he approaches Scrooge is less forceful. And I think there is sort of a reason for this, because I think the point when we see the ghost of Christmas past, Scrooge has no interest whatsoever in changing, and when he's confronted with his past, he starts to regret how the life choices he's made, but it is only with that force he would have seen it. Whereas I think now we're moving on to these ghosts who become less forceful because it's necessary for Scrooge to make his own choices and not because he's been told to. And we are going to read the extract when the Ghost of Christmas Present arrives. So it was clothed in one simple green robe or mantle bordered with white fur. This garment hung so loosely on the figure that its capacious breast was bare, as if disdaining to be warded or concealed by any artifice. Its feet, observable beneath the ample folds of the garment, were also bare, and on its head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath set here and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free as its genial face, its sparkling eye, its open hand, its cheery voice, its unconstrained demeanour, and its joyful air. Girded around its middle was an antique scabbard, but no sword was in it, and the ancient sheath was eaten up with rust. So I'm going to take the first quote today, and I'm just going to read it, and then I'm going to zoom in on the imagery of the green robe first. So it was clothed in one simple green robe or mantle bordered with white fur. This garment hung so loosely on the figure that its capacious breast was bare, as if disdaining to be warded or concealed by any artifice. And so before we jump into sort of this idea of the green robe, I just want to contextualize it and talk about our version of Father Christmas. So in a modern day, our version of Father Christmas, so that you generally think of a jolly old man with a beard, and he's often clothed in red robes with a sack. The reason why we now think of Father Christmas that way is, and some of you may know this, is because during a marketing campaign for Coca-Cola in the 1930s, that was the image that was projected, and it was heavily popularized. But there have been many versions of Father Christmas, and the tradition, and the one for the Victorians was a traditional version of a man dressed in green, and so this image of Father Christmas would have been there to their sort of knowledge. And he was based off of a man, a historical St. Nicholas, who was a fourth Greek bishop, and he was basically known for his generosity, and in particular helping the poor, which I think the reason why the Ghost of Christmas Present and the imagery of the green robe here is important is because, like we know, Dickens wanted the rich to help those in poverty. And so I think that alludes to his message. And St. Nicholas was very, very generous. He basically saved 3 impoverished daughters from prostitution of a poor family because he paid for the dowries. This is the money that you would have to pay in exchange for their daughter's hand in marriage. So they didn't have to enter this dire state. They were saved. He also would drop coins and down chimneys, which sort of goes down to this idea that Santa climbs down the chimney, doesn't he, and gives the presents. So another thing then, in terms of this representation of Father Christmas is that it is actually taken from paganism, and the colour imagery of green links to the season, the coming of spring, and this idea that with spring it's a new start, but also it can bring happiness.
Yeah.
And I don't know what you if you had anything to say about it. Did you add
yeah, so it's just this idea of green, like Miss Wan's already said, the coming of spring, and it's about this kind of the hope for the future to kind of help you through those bleak, dark, miserable winter months.
Moving on further, we've got this imagery of the garment that hung so loosely on the figure that its capacious breast was bare, as if disdaining to be warded or concealed by any artifice. And what that basically means, the adjective capacious, is this idea that it's a really roomy space, and the artifice is something that we'd use to trick or deceive others. Because his isn't concealed, and this idea that he's, I don't know, this idea of his sort of chest being open, that it kind of suggests that his message is a true and honest message about generosity. There's nothing to hide or trick Scrooge,
Yeah.
I think, isn't it? It's quite like an innocent image there, isn't it, of making sure that we are, I don't know, mindful to be, what's another word, apart from saying generous, mindful to think about
think about others. About others.
And so
being selfless.
Yeah, being selfless. And I think that the initial introduction there of the green robe and the way that he is described later on would heavily allude to the image that of Father Christmas that the Victorians would have cultural knowledge of. There's anything to add to that?
Yeah, just kind of following on from what you said about this idea of honesty and innocence, you can kind of even tie that the use of the adjective white into that, because obviously white has connotations of innocence and purity and kind of not being tainted with things, so you could bring that in. And also kind of just following on from what Ms. Wan said about the use of this noun artifice. So it's the idea that an artifice is used to, like Ms. Wan said, deceive or cleverly trick someone. And I think, again, you could link this to Dickens's message, particularly on kind of religious beliefs. So he kind of, like we've said in previous lessons, Dickens didn't, it's not that he was against the church, it was against the fact that he thought they weren't doing enough or they weren't doing what they should be doing. And later on in this stave, Scrooge has a bit of an interaction with the Ghost of Christmas Present, and talks about religious people and about it being a Sabbath day, and that shops and kind of restaurants and things like that are closed on a Sunday because it's a Sabbath day. And he talks about the fact that he says these so-called men of the cloth. So again, it's this idea of kind of men of the cloth is like a religious reference to like holy men or people who work for the church or whatever. So perhaps it could link to this idea of kind of higher powers such as religion, and people doing things in the name of religion are actually deceiving people. So I don't know, maybe that's a bit too far-fetched, but Dickens definitely has an issue with the church kind of not doing what they should be doing, and people doing things in their name when they're not really helping people. So you could kind of link this idea of deception or tricking people into thinking they're doing what they should be doing, but they're not really.
Yeah, and I think this theme of, the importance of prioritising generosity, as Miss Harrison goes into the next description, there's like further motifs of that, and for example, the open hand is one example, but I won't go too much into that until Miss Harrison's turn. Yeah.
All right. Right. Okay then. So this quote is from the kind of latter part of description of the Ghost of Christmas Present. So it's dark brown curls, were long and free. Free is its genial face, its sparkling eyes, its open hand, its cheery voice, its unconstrained demeanour, and its joyful air. Girded round its middle was an antique scabbard, but no sword was in it, and the ancient sheath was eaten up with rust. Okay, so we've kind of got two parts to this quote. We've got the description of the ghost of Christmas Present, and then we've got this reference to a sheath and a scabbard. Okay, so we're going to do the first part together. So as you can see, there is a huge like semantic field of kind of positive adjectives here. So we've got free, genial, sparkling, open, cheery, unconstrained, and joyful. So obviously all of these completely contrast or juxtapose Scrooge's description, which is very dark and bleak and miserable. But in particular, I'm going to focus on a couple of things here. We've got the sparkling eye. Obviously, sparkling has connotations of light, which again we've talked a lot about as light is being used as a motif all the way throughout the novella. For this idea of being enlightening for Scrooge and this idea of clarity. Things that we've said in the past can link to sparkling, so I'm not going to kind of go over it again. But probably the most important bit in here is this idea of the open hand. So if you think about hands opening, if you just put your hands out in front of you, it's kind of this symbol of generosity and being giving, which again directly juxtaposes and contrasts with Scrooge's tight-fistedness. So in the beginning, right at the beginning of the novella, when Scrooge is described, it says he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone. And we can see his tight-fistedness through his actions, particularly in Stave 1. He doesn't give Bob very much coal for his fire. He's tight with his money, he's tight with his time, he's tight with his generosity, he's tight with his emotions and love and relationships. So going on to kind of following on from what Ms. Wan said about the Ghost of Christmas Present being kind of paralleled with Father Christmas, it's obviously this idea of being generous and not necessarily giving presents, but being charitable and giving to those who are less fortunate. And again, the open hand is a huge kind of symbol. And I think, was it last year when somebody got a grade 9 from literally talking about tight-fisted and the open hand? They literally used those two quotes, and they got a grade 9. So if you can kind of go into the symbolism of that, you can talk a lot about it and how it kind of symbolises Scrooge's transformation. So the next thing I'm going to go on to is the second part of the quote. So girded round its middle was an antique scabbard, but no sword. So a scabbard is something that you would put a sword in to kind of protect it so you wouldn't get cut. But there was no sword in it. So obviously swords have connotations of war, of pain, of death. But obviously there's no sword in the scabbard. So the thing that can inflict pain and harm and death isn't there. So it's this idea that of peace. And this isn't in the novella, but if you can remember watching the Disney film, it says when Scrooge comments on this, the ghost says peace on earth. So it's this idea of peace, and that kind of taking negative things out of the world, like swords that can inflict harm and pain and death, will make the world a much better place. Okay, and the fact that the ancient sheath, which is again just another word for a scabbard, so it's just another word for something to put a sword in, was eaten up with rust. So again, it's this idea that the kind of the negativity of the past, with this idea of it being ancient, has kind of been left to rot and rust, and it's not in use anymore. So we could potentially take that as kind of a bit of a metaphor for Scrooge leaving his negativity in the past and letting those kind of things, you know, his greed, his cruelty, his cold-heartedness, let those eat up with rust. Okay, you could even again take this one step further with the sword obviously being a symbol of pain and death. You could potentially link that to the hard and sharp as flint, which obviously flint was used as like the head of an arrow, which again is used to inflict pain and death. So if Scrooge leaves those in the past, just like the Ghost of Christmas Past has left the sword to rot and rust, then he will be able to kind of leave all those things. He'll change, and not only change his ways, but he'll change his future. He'll change people's opinions of him. And life will be obviously a lot better, not just for him, but for those who are around him. Have you got anything to add to that?
The only thing I need to add to that, because Miss Harrison's like really on her way with an excellent analysis, was about making these links now, because we get again saying further across the novella, and two things. One, I guess the idea of the Ghost of Christmas Present, synonymous with Father Christmas, is that imagine what we said about Scrooge's previous experience of Christmas and why he hates it. You know, when we look at the past encounter when he was in the boarding school, that the fact that the Ghost of Christmas Present is the embodiment of Christmas, that he's cheery and he's sparkling, could link to this idea, and joyful, could link to the things that Scrooge missed out on, and it's a reminder that this is what Christmas is about, sort of sharing happiness. The second thing I noticed was the sparkling. That is exactly the same way that Fred was described in Stave 1. And, you know, Fred is the embodiment of generosity and life.
And Christmas spirit
as
well.
Yeah, it's Christmas spirit. And Miss Harrison said it's not necessarily, when we say generous, we don't mean, you know, giving money and presents. It's not just about that. It's about giving your time to somebody, showing kindness. And I think Fred being the embodiment of that, and the fact that, again, we've got this parallel of the adjective sparkling here and previously, it reminds Scrooge the benefits, because Fred is pretty happy, isn't he? He's very content with the life that he's chosen and the marriage that he's in. So those are the two things I was wanting to add.
Yeah. All right, guys, we'll see you next time. Hope you found it useful.